We have seen some Spring Boot features like dependency management and auto configuration. Now we'll talk about packaging and integration testing. When it comes to packaging, Spring Boot offers you different options. You can package your application as a jar file, as a Word file, or even a container. The latest versions of a Spring Boot allow you to create an OCI container from your application so you can deploy it in platforms like Kubernetes. We'll be focusing on the jar files here, and the jars that we'll be creating are called UberJar or fat jars because they contain all the libraries, all the dependencies that our application needs. This will also include an embedded servlet container in the case of a web application. That could be Tomcat, Undertow, Jetty. So now our application will be self-contained in a jar file. So we can use java-jar, the name of the jar file, to execute your application. How can we create this jar file? We'll be using the Spring Boot plugin, and you can use Gradle or Maven to create the jar file. In Gradle, you'll be doing Gradle assemble. In Maven, you'll be doing Maven package. This will create two jar files. One, which will be the UberJar containing all the dependencies. And the second one will be the normal jar that will contain just your classes, the compiled classes of your application, but without libraries, without dependencies. It's just going to be your code. This is going to be the Maven plugin that we'll be using. In Maven, we'll be defining this plugin called Spring Boot Maven plugin. And this extends the package goal to create the jar file. So when you do Maven package, it will also create the jar file for you. But it also has other goals like Spring Boot Run that allows you to execute your application. So you can do Maven Spring Boot Run and execute your application without packaging it. Right? So pretty helpful as well. So these are the two jar files that will be generated. When you do Maven package, in the target directory, you will see these two files. The first one will be the UberJar. Notice it's 22 megs. It contains all the libraries that you need to execute your application. Also the embedded servlet container. The second jar file, called jar original, is containing just your application classes. Notice that it's only 5K because it's just containing your classes, right? So you'll be using the UberJar to execute the application. That's the self-contained jar, the one in blue. All right, so that's basically how we package the application. Now, let's move into the next section, which is integration testing. We have seen how to bootstrap the application context in a test environment. But was that application context started the same way a Spring Boot application is started? Probably not, and the main reason is because we have been using the add Spring JUnit config annotation. So that was basically picking some classes and creating the application context, but there was no auto configuration. Now we'll change the annotation to Spring Boot test, and notice how the Spring Boot test annotation allows you to define the entry point to your application. This class's attribute point to the application class, in that case, that will be annotated with the Spring Boot application. Remember that a Spring Boot application enables the auto configuration. Now, the application context will be created the same way as a Spring Boot application, with the same configuration, the same auto configuration, picking the application.properties, everything that a Spring Boot will do for you. In terms of testing, you'll be testing your classes the same way. You'll be auto-wiring beans from the application context and using them in your test. Nothing changes. We are just changing the annotation that will change the way we create the application context. You can safely omit the class inside the Spring Boot test because the Spring Boot test will be intelligent enough to discover your entry point. How is that going to happen? It will go up in the hierarchy and will try to get a class annotated with a Spring Boot configuration. Remember that a Spring Boot application is annotated with a Spring Boot configuration. It's a configuration class, it's doing component scanning, and it's also enabling auto configuration. Usually, we only have one class annotated with a Spring Boot configuration, which is our entry point, the one annotated with a Spring Boot application. So now the Spring Boot test will auto-discover your entry point to your Spring Boot application. And that's basically everything about the Spring Boot and integration testing. In a later module, we'll deep dive in integration testing and learn a little bit more.